Oh, so is that that one? Welcome. Yeah, I did. It was in London actually, very simple. So if you go here, well, not here, here, right? What are the two presentations? I've got it in preview. I don't know, but it works well. Okay, is that correct? If you're happy with it. And then you can navigate. Seems to be alright. Yeah, there's on preview mode. Yeah. It's a PDF. What? PDF. P. Is it? Yeah. I'll see. Presentation. Good presentation. Non-challenging. Oh, yeah. The one that. Alright, okay, so where is it? So it should be better now. So you go here. Oh, there. I'll see downloads. Looking on that one again. On this one. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Arnold. You see this message? Maybe you can just follow through. Oh, shoot. This message. I'm not asking you. Right. This is a person. I think this person was responsible for the mission. I've met Arnold, who is also volunteering. Well, Arnold is maybe. Yeah, when she says Arnold, volunteer. Volunteer. Did she message me? there's a PowerPoint version, I think.
I think there's a PowerPoint.
Yeah, this was what they sent to me, and that's what I put on.
And you slideshow with a PDF.
Huh? Yeah, you can slideshow PDF, but I'm just surprised it's full screen mode. Yeah, and then it's next, yeah. And does this work? That's awesome. I'm pressing this stuff.
Okay, so I'm responsible for the first session. Is it this presentation?
No.
That's the opening, right?
Yeah. The first one is Keynote. It's the fun.
Okay. So when are we? Seems like. Okay. Ooh. Okay. Oh, no, the keynote. Oh, okay. We're not too behind.
Oh, no, but hi, Christine. I'm Vimbo. I'm one of the co-chairs who's been emailing you. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
I'm very, not really. I saw I am the only white person.
No. There were a few others.
A few others?
No.
Okay.
Well, that could be true, actually.
Yeah.
The other person was the moderator, so you're right.
Okay, good.
But
Anyway.
Chika is also helping presentations. I think that's why you were looking for.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. I was just wondering, let me check whether.
Is it about activism?
Multi-layered, yeah?
My name is
Can I?
Lance Christine.
Is it this? No, then it's not arrived yet. These are
I
the only
sent it
two
last
slides.
night.
Could you send it again to me this time?
Can I give you
Can I get
a
it?
USB stick?
Huh?
Give
USB?
it to your USB stick.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Do you have one? Yeah. Yeah. What for? Is it? Let's test to make sure it's working. That's which one? The first one?
Below, one below.
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, this right? Okay. You want to come on? Morning. This one. Another one? Yeah. someone among them is starting. They need to go grab a biscuit before they clear the whole stuff up.
Test 1 2, test 1 2. Can you hear me? I don't think it's hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello.
Hello?
Do I have to press the button?
Good morning. Good morning. Should I use that? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I have the honor this morning to open the second day of the conference. And yesterday, when we went to our gala dinner, which some of you, I think, have attended, I realized that the best speeches are the ones that come from the heart and where you haven't prepared anything. And actually, this situation reminds me a lot of last year, because last year I had the honor of being one of the co-chairs of the Africa Conference 2015, and we had President Mahama as a keynote speaker. Now, as soon as you have a president coming to Oxford, you have a lot of work for the last 2 weeks before the conference is happening, because every day you'll have visitors coming from an embassy that want to know something about Oxford, want to be hosted for lunch and see the venue once again. And eventually, I really completely ran out of time to prepare anything for my speech I had to give back then to open the conference. And then President Mahama came too early and also stole my last 10 minutes before the program started to prepare. So I was completely unprepared, but somehow it worked, and we had a great first day, just like yesterday was a great first day. And I'm sure that the first the second day today will be equally great for all of us. But as the president of the Africa Society here in Oxford, I think I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about this conference and about the theme that this conference is being run under and what that means to us as students in Oxford and generally people who are interested to drive change on the continent. The theme says challenging narratives, governance, youth leadership, and business in Africa. Now, challenging narratives. To be honest, before I came to Oxford, I haven't used narratives as a term that much, but then I came to Oxford in 2014 and realized that there's like 4 or 5 terms that I hear all the time, and that when I say them, my professors will like me. Narratives was one of them. But to be honest, I think narratives is something that is often used in journalism to describe a story that is being reiterated by a certain number of people. I think by just having an Africa conference in itself, you also create a narrative, right? Because saying that you can have a conference where you discuss an entire continent in 2 days is actually quite a statement. And at the end of the day, it shows that we think that there's a story that holds Africa together. But I think it also shows that we see a gap when it comes to being able to discuss issues that we care about in our day-to-day education. And I think that having studied in the MSc in African Studies here myself in Oxford, I know that there's sometimes not enough opportunity to discuss Africa in our curricula. And therefore, I deem it very important to have these Africa conferences, even though you could criticize how much of the continent you can really cover in such a short period of time. I went to Paris a couple of weeks ago because for those of you who study business, it might be interesting. There has been a new network been set up called the European Network of African Students at Business Schools in Europe. And this network meets about once or twice a year to pretty much have the opportunity to exchange experiences and network and make new friends. And the organizer of the conference that we had in Paris had this slide that he showed in the beginning of the conference we had in Paris. And it had a timeline of all the different Africa conferences that are happening in Europe. And when I saw that, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so much competition. How are we gonna survive that? It was pretty much on average, especially now in spring, where we get towards the end of the academic year, it was probably 2 conferences in a month sometimes, right? That are discussing Africa. And obviously there's a lot of these conferences happening in England too. So again, you could ask, do we need so many conferences that discuss Africa? I say yes, because here you're at the Oxford Africa Conference, and what you will learn here is how we view Africa and how we would like to engage with you on the continent, which is in a very interdisciplinary manner. Because one thing that we think is overstated is to only discuss business. Business is one aspect of African development, but it's not all aspects that count in order to understand how we can drive change in Africa. Anyways, so narratives, I've spoken about that. Now, the second aspect is governance in Africa. I think there's a lot of good speakers here who can talk about this better than I could. So I will not talk about the political aspect of governance and the political leadership aspect of governance because there's much better people here who can talk about that. But I think what is important is that governance is also something that counts to us as an Africa society. Because to be honest, if you look at the number of people that are abroad in the diaspora, especially in the UK, but also in the States and many other non-African countries, it only shows that we need to find more ways to organize ourselves. The Africa Society has come a long way. The Africa Society was founded in the 1950s, so it really has been here for quite a while, with its ups and downs. But the value of being able to create a society of Africans that have been in Oxford and do all kinds of different things in Oxford, partially also being presidents in Africa, for instance, John Kufuor, who was the president of Ghana back a couple of years ago, just has a lot of powerful opportunities, because if we organize ourselves better as Africans at universities like this, it means we can also work better together to work on the projects that we care about. And I think even for the Africa Society, there's still quite a few challenges when it comes to figuring out how we can engage better with our alumni, how can we do better when it comes to networking with other Africa clubs that are in England or in Europe or even elsewhere in the world. But I think governance is something that you can really view as an aspect that you need to care about in your personal life. how can I pretty much try and set up processes and an environment for myself that helps me to have the right access to the right people. And I think that this conference is one of the culmination points where we're trying to do just that. The other point is that governance also lives a lot from diversity. I guess there's a common thread when it comes to the perception, probably true perception, that there's a lot of fairly old leaders governing Africa right now, but there's also other aspects of diversity, not only age, but also gender diversity, diversity when it comes to the economic background that people grew up with that are really able to carry out political leadership and sit in governments. And we think that it's important, especially if you are in a place like Oxford that is fairly elite, to also think about the people that are marginalized on the continent. We have all been very privileged with the paths that we have been taking and the positions that we've been able to be in, the programs that we've been able to enroll on when it comes to studying Africa or other things that we're excited about. But we should also think about governance in a broader sense and an inclusive sense. So I encourage everyone here to think about Africa this way as well and try to think about the people that are on the ground that are maybe not able to access such a conference. Youth leadership is obviously at the heart of this conference, right? And at this point, I would also start to express a few words of gratitude because we have had 3 co-chairs who are probably the greatest young leaders that we've had in this Africa Society for this year, which are Ruvimbo Nyangoni, Suzanne Ewing, and I don't know where Rutendo is. Okay, Rutendo's probably organizing something, which only shows her commitment. But Ruvimbo Nyangoni, Suzanne Ewing, and Rutendo Chigora have done an amazing job to organize this conference. And obviously, I know what you feel like, right? You wonder, okay, why am I actually spending so many hours next to all my studies I have to do for 8 months to organize a conference that is 2 days long? So it's actually a big commitment, right? But I think once you come here and you realize how many fruitful conversations happen at the conference and how much new perspective can be generated in the panels and keynote speeches that we see here, it only shows that it was valuable and that we should only be thankful for the commitment. But I guess the other point to point out when it comes to youth leadership is also a development that has been very important in the university landscape over the past 1.5 years, which is Rose Must Fall. Rose Must Fall has gotten a lot of traction here in Oxford when it comes to questions about decolonizing education and decolonizing the university landscape. And we think that it is also another way to show that youth leadership is very important to have a more diverse era of opinion that is generated by young Africans or young Black people that are coming to Oxford, and also people who are interested in the topic. Now, I'm going to stop talking very soon because we have a keynote speaker that is much better at giving speeches than me, and we also have Callum Miller, who's going to give a bit of a more perspective from the Blavatsky School of Government. But I'd love to close with saying a few words about the business aspect of the theme. I think that business is obviously extremely important, and I personally, because of the background I've had, believe very, very much in private sector development in Africa. But again, I think the offer of this conference is to try and broaden your perspective on the continent beyond just seeing the business opportunity. A lot we see these days is about the big consumer opportunity in Africa. Okay, there's 1.2 billion people that want to have consumer products. There's a lot of mobile opportunity, a lot of telecom opportunity, internet penetration is growing, etc. So yes, there's a business opportunity, probably. Now people are starting to doubt it because of the oil prices, but I think in general people still believe it. But I think really understanding what African business models can look like that are not necessarily just trying to look at the opportunity and how to reap most of the money, but rather also understanding what do I have to understand about African capitalism differently in order to be successful as an entrepreneur if I want to, is extremely important. And we hope that with the program that has been developed for this conference, we can encourage you to think about that in a different way as well. I'd like to thank you once again for making your way to Oxford. I'd like to thank the Blavatsky School of Government for hosting us here for the day and giving us the opportunity to use this wonderful, very new building. I'd also like to thank Mr. Ekpe already, even though you haven't spoken yet, for making your way here as our keynote speaker today. And I would also like to thank the innovators who have come from different parts of the continent and will give pitches today about their ventures that we probably all enjoy very much. I wish you a very great day at the conference and hope to hear more about what your narrative about Africa is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Good morning. My name is Callum Miller. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Blavatnik School of Government. And on behalf of our Dean, Professor Nairi Woods, and all the faculty, staff, and students of the school, it's my pleasure to welcome you all this morning. Very excited to have you in our new building and taking part in the second day of your conference. I was rather relieved to learn that my task was to stand in front of you on a Saturday morning behind a podium rather than to strut the catwalk for you last night. I think that might have been marginally less successful, but I'm delighted to know that yesterday evening went very well as to learn that you had a very successful first day to the conference yesterday. I've been asked just to say a few words about the Blavatnik School of Government, to give you a little bit of context about the work that we do here in the building in which you are meeting. The Blavatnik School of Government was founded in 2010. We took our first students in 2012. We moved into this new building at the end of last year, and it was officially opened last week. So we're a young school, and we're growing quite fast. We're a school which is trying to do something which is simple to say, but quite hard to achieve, and that's to improve government. And it's our belief that every government in the world is getting something right. Most governments in the world, from the perspective of their citizens, are getting quite a lot of things wrong. But that by learning from each other and by studying carefully and with attention to the evidence, what's working and what's not working in governments around the world, we can help just a little bit to improve what's happening in government. And given the scale of government, given the importance of government to everybody's lives, if we can inch forward the quality of government in every country just a little bit, that will have an enormous effect. So that's our ambition here at the school. And we try to do that in three ways. The first of those is research. So looking at all aspects of government, from delivery of services through the management of government and electoral processes and the integrity of government. We're very pleased to have a number of flourishing research programs here at the school. Some of you will be familiar with the Centre for the Study of African Economies, which we are now very pleased to share with the Economics faculty. And I think Stefan Durkin was part of your program yesterday, who heads that program. We've also been working recently under the leadership of Matuli and Kube on a program called Rethink HIV, looking at the challenges that the HIV epidemic poses for the macroeconomic management of many African countries in particular. And we're now moving into a program looking at urbanization and the big challenges of urbanization, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in a number of other continents of the world. Our research is deliberately multidisciplinary. We think that it's not just political scientists or economists or business academics to talk about government, but actually we also have immunologists and psychologists and philosophers and lawyers in the faculty here, all working together to try and bring insights from different branches of academic disciplines to understand better the challenges of government. Second thing we do is obviously teaching, and we have a very successful one-year Masters of Public Policy program. Some of the leaders of this conference are students of ours, and it's great to see them so engaged in making today's conference happen. We have, this year, 117 students on that program from 54 countries, 15 of whom are from Africa. And it's our belief that having such a diverse cohort is a real strength of learning. One of the things we say is that compared to some other similar programs elsewhere in the world, no country, no nationality is in the majority. So everybody experiences the challenges of having a minority perspective. And that means that everybody's assumptions are challenged all the time. You might come to a class and not even know that you held an assumption, but when you put it forward as an opinion, you're bound to be challenged by one of your peers who has a different perspective. And we think that's a really healthy way to stimulate people's reflection on the challenges that they may face as leaders in the future. And the last thing we focus on is engagement. And conferences like this, where we bring together leaders from the business sector, from government, from academia, from civil society, are a key example of that. Over the last 2 days, we've hosted here our annual Challenges of Government conference, and we've had a group of people of that kind of profile from many countries around the world, focusing in on these questions. And we really believe that by engaging with leaders, whether from the business sector or from policy making or government, we get a much richer understanding of the challenges. Many of you as students and researchers will know the difficulty of matching up the typical research timeline, which tends to be long because it's rigorous, and the typical policy timeline, which tends to be short, and I'm not going to comment on its rigor. And what we try to do is try to work closely with policymakers and others, almost to anticipate the questions that are going to arise for them in the near future, so that we can try and deliver real-time research that is actually meaningful and useful to policymakers today, rather than simply the analysis after the event of where they may have made mistakes. So it's really important for us that we engage with policymakers and other practitioners to understand the challenges that they're facing. It was my pleasure to welcome you to our new building. As I say, we opened in November of last year and had our official opening last week. The building's designed to support the mission of the school. So as we talk about improving government, we're committed to values of openness, transparency, engagement, and of convening people together. And as you'll see, I hope, when you spend time during the breakout sessions in the forum area, which you entered this morning, that's really designed to bring folk together and to have a convening space. And the hubbub that arises when you're engaged in your coffee conversations and when you're meeting others and discussing the key issues is an important part of the lifeblood of the school. One of the nice things about having a very open space that goes all the way up through our 6 floors is that, and I say this just to give you a little bit of advice, when you're having that quiet conversation in the corner down here, occasionally it will be heard on the 4th floor. And that just brings the whole school to life. It gives us a sense of the activity that's happening and the discussions that are taking place, and that's ultimately what we're all about as a school. I mentioned that we had our Challenges of Government conference over the last 2 days, and some of the themes that came out from those rich conversations I think are really germane to what you're going to be talking about today. We heard a lot about the need for greater accountability, for a real gap in citizens' trust between what they think their government should be doing and what they observe their governments are doing, and the need for government leaders to do something about that, and the need for citizens to articulate those needs and to agitate effectively in order to improve that accountability. We secondly heard a lot about competence. Quite dramatically, one of our speakers, who was a former senior minister in the British government, talked about the incompetence of the European Union with regards to migration policy. And this theme of the importance of competence as a component of building trust in government was a really strong theme for us, and I'm sure is one that you've been discussing over the last day as well. Thirdly, adaptation to change. Lots of talk about disruption. As an anecdote, I mean, any of you who work in the tech sector will know how fashionable it is to bounce into a meeting, often without shoes on, probably wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and challenge some people by saying, we need to disrupt. You know, this is all too complacent. We need to introduce some disruption. For many people who were taking part in our conference, and I suspect many of you talking about your experiences in the countries that you study and work on, disruption is not a choice. It's a matter of fact. So I think there's sometimes a sort of bit of complacency from the Silicon Valley types who think that this is a new thing one can introduce, when actually many people are living with it on a daily basis. But the challenge for governments is how to adapt to that disruption, how to be able to deal with constant change and not to get complacent and locked in to historic ways of doing things and not be able to adapt to what's coming next. And lastly, and I think very centrally to your topic of governance, we talked a lot about integrity. One of our speakers said very clearly that the single most important thing in any political leader is judgment, is that confidence that the person, when put on the spot, when faced with difficult choices, because all government is ultimately about making choices and sometimes about making compromise between different and competing visions, what you really want to see in that leader is judgment. And when we think about the theme of youth leadership that you have today, and we think about the work of our school in working with many talented young people who we hope will go on to be leaders of their countries and other organizations, that quality of integrity and judgment is a critical part. And that's why here at the school, and those of our students whom you speak with during the next few days will tell you about this, we start in the very first term with a program which we call Foundations, which is all about the ethics and the moral philosophy underpinning how one is a good leader. And so it was interesting that that was really a theme that came out of our conference, and I'm sure will come out of your work as well. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you today. I hope you have a wonderful day, as I know you did yesterday, and that the discussions that you have here will be part of an ongoing dialogue. As I mentioned, the Blavatnik School is committed to engaging with people, to working closely with all folk who share our commitment to improving government. And if your visit here is a taster, we very much hope it will only be your first, and that we'll see you back here often engaging in the work that we do. So best wishes for today's conference, and thank you very much for honouring us with your presence here.
everyone. Thank you so much for coming here and welcome to our home, Oxford. You will not hear this enough. We're so grateful to have you here. My name is Rimbo Nyangoni. I'm one of the co-chairs, and on behalf of the organizing committee, my fellow co-chairs, Suzanne Newing and Rutendo Chigora, we're really excited to have you here. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Arnold Ekpe, our keynote speaker. I was meant to read out his bio, but I decided not to because he told me to keep it short. But from the conversations I've had with him, I will say that he's a very candid man to have a conversation with. Today, he's giving you this opportunity to have a conversation with him. Please feel free to put him on the grill because he's already done that with me. He has over 30 years experience in the banking sector. He started off at Manchester Business School and then went on to Citibank, and then now has a legacy of leading EcoBank to its success. He's also chairman and non-executive director of Atlas Mara Corporation, which recently completed a transaction as the first African bank to acquire UK bank, Crown Agents. So I think from all that, please be pumped and excited to welcome to the floor, Mr. Arnold Ekpe.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to give the keynote speech on a miserable day in Oxford on Saturday. But I live just, I think, a mile down the road, so it wasn't a big deal for me to come down here. The English weather, as most of you know, it's extremely unpredictable, so I'm glad we're under a roof here, and thanks for the Blavatnik. I've never been able to pronounce it correctly, but I think that's the name. For this first time for me to be here. I walk past here quite often because I go to the Phoenix Cinema down the road from time to time. And of course, my dear friend, Tuli, sent me a nice note, which was basically, Arnold, you better show up because these kids want to talk to you, and you'll be a big disappointment if you don't show up. So there was a lot of pressure on me, actually, to come. But good pressure, let me put it that way. Very good pressure. I'm going to talk to you, but I can tell you that my first problem was understanding the topic of this conference. And I decided that it was only a bunch of Oxford students who would come up with such a convoluted topic. I think the topic said needs a conference to understand what it's all about. How you put governance and students and business all in one was something very interesting. So I'm going to try and address it in a very candid way. And I'm hoping that in doing so, I'm actually going to raise some points and some issues that will be of interest to you. I'm very optimistic in Africa, but I'm also very realistic in Africa. And I think most people, when they talk about Africa, they think it's one country. It's not one country. Africa is 54 countries, and each country has its own characteristics. So before I really start, can you put up your hands if you've been to one African country? Okay. 5, 10, 20, 30. You have an unfair advantage. You were with the ADB, so that's 40, 50. Okay, I put a man. Okay. But that was an occupational thing. I had to go to those countries. Can you put up your hands if you've been to one non-African country? Because you're here, so that qualifies. 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Okay, put up my hand. The reason why I say that actually was because next to the formal education you're having, the best form of education you can get is travel. Meeting different people, different cultures, different communities. And understanding that the challenges that face the world and the challenges that face Africa are very similar. And the difference is how each community has handled that problem. Many of us heard about the Africa Rising story coming after the Africa was a hopeless continent. And was Africa really rising? I think is the question. I never thought Africa was rising. I always felt that that was hype. And let me tell you why. China grew for 3 decades in double digits. All right? To begin to catch up with the rest of the world. Africa grew for 1.5 decades, if we want to be generous, and the middle single digits. Can that be Africa rising? I think at best it was Africa recovering. And Africa looked good because China slowed down. And the rest of the world was in recession. So the Africa rising story was a relative story. It wasn't a real story. And I'll come to the issue of Africa development because that raises some very interesting issues. I'd probably like to play some slides to you. I hope I get this to work right. And walk you through a whole process. And then I'm going to follow on to that to raise some very interesting issues that I hope addresses the question of this conference. Now, there are 2 passports here. One is a British passport, and the other is a Nigerian passport. Now, can you tell me which passport allows you easiest passage across Africa? It is the British passport. That raises a question. Why? So all Africans, we say we're Africans, but it's easier to travel as a foreigner in Africa than to travel as an African. Now, some of you would remember the photo on the right or left, depending on how you're looking at it. Now, that photo came up when there was the bomb attack in Paris, right? And everybody flew in, including the African, and they all held hands and said, "We will not be terrorized," right? When there was a bomb in a mall in Kenya, they issued a Kenya travel warning. Avoid Kenya, don't come there, okay? Stay away. We did not have people marching down the main boulevard in Kenya saying, "Never mind the terrorists, we'll stand united and we'll take them on." Right? Now, that is a care ad. I have an issue about all these crazy ads about poor children and dirty water and all that. About this poor African kid, and there are a lot of poor kids in Africa, don't get me wrong. Isn't that the image most people have of Africa? Now, where do you think that is? It's downtown Nairobi at night. And there's several cities like that. How many of you have an image of that Africa? Very few. Of course there are, but very, very few. And actually, when you're African, you don't count. I'm talking about internationally. Internationally. Now, one of the things people don't realize is that Africa has the same level of urbanization as China. Africa is more urbanized than India. India has a larger proportion of poor people than Africa. You don't get that image of India regularly. Okay. Now, this is going to be really dangerous territory for me, but I'm going to go. What is that? That is called the okuko. Do you guys know what the okuko means? It means a cockerel. There are a bunch of very intelligent Oxford guys who are asking for the okuko to be removed, right? Because that is a great symbol of colonialism and stuff like that, right? Now, next to it
a bunch of Arab youths who were trying to change their government. This is purely symbolic. This is real. And the challenge I have for you youths is, do you want to spend your time trying to remove the Okuko from its stand, or do you want to change your governments? When I was in college, in university, because here we call it university, it's America, they call it college, in the 70s, we used to go out and say, free Mandela. He was in free Mandela. And after that, you went and had a booze up in the pub, and that was good. Okay? But we felt we were making a statement, not a symbolic statement. We're trying to make real change. And we have to decide, as young people, whether or not you want to make real change, or you want to do so. Whether that Okuko is on the stand or not doesn't change Africa. Makes no difference whatsoever to Africa. It might make you feel good. Yeah, we've removed this symbol of colonialism. Complete waste of time. Now, which continent has the highest roaming charges in the world? It's Africa. The EU, as a matter of fact, regulates technology charges to make technology more accessible to the masses. In Africa, we don't, and we have the poorer people. So South Africa is proud to be one of the most costly for telecom roaming charges. Now, economic blocks. And Prof here knows what I'm talking about because he looked at those things. Africa has how many economic blocks? Maybe 6. They're now beginning to talk to each other, but they're only beginning to talk to each other. And then COMESA and SADC and the other ones wanted to create one large one going down this way. Europe has 1. So we can't even agree on one economic bloc. Right? And what does that do? It does a lot of interesting things. Never mind whether the euro is in convulsions or not, they have one currency. In Africa, except for the Francophone areas, you have, 34 currencies. It's easier. Did I get it wrong? Okay, I think it's easier, far easier, to move from a local currency to the dollar or the euro than it is to exchange between African countries, from the shilling to the dollar C, or from the kwacha to the CD. Difficult, impossible. They don't do it. Now, in case you don't recognize this, guys, this is the president of the most fantastically corrupt country in the world. Okay? As he said, okay? He is the prime minister of the best money laundering capital in the world, the UK. Why do you think property prices in the UK are so high? Because if you want to buy one stock, one share, you'll have to give a whole history. You go through a whole KYC process. But if you want to buy a 40 million pound apartment in Hyde Park, you just wire the money, and you use an offshore company. Hopefully it's not on the Panama Leaks list. And that's all you do. So he says to him, okay, we are corrupt, but you're holding the money. Give us back our money. You know what he says? No, we have to go through the legal process. Now, some of you recognize this as well. This is the president of China. These are some African presidents. Now, Which is the democracy here? These ones, they're all democratic presidents, democratically elected. Or him. Who thinks he's more democratic than this guy? Who does? Okay, I do. Okay, I'm the only one. Let me explain to you why. If you understand the Chinese process, he knows he's there for only 10 years, and he's off. It's not his cousin or his son that's going to take over from him. They have a process. Okay? He's been there for 37 years. He's 40, he's tired, so he says he's going to step down. He's going to die on the job. He's like, I'm not sure, okay? He doesn't spend most of the time in Cameroon. He just extended his term so that he's hereditary, so he's just there forever. He just changed the rules in Uganda. He is in Chad, he's been there forever. And, of course, you know al-Bashir in Sudan, who is democratic. What does democracy mean? Yes. Do you know who this guy is? He is the richest man in Africa. He's also my friend. The two don't go together, I'm saying. But you ask yourself, why the question mark? It's not because he's a dodgy person, because clearly he's not. He's a nice guy. Very humble guy, very simple guy. Hugely successful. The question is, why is he alone? How many Pan-African industrialists do we have? Industry. I do not count black empowerment billionaires in South Africa. That doesn't count. That's transfer of assets. Self-made people who've built businesses, who create jobs, create employment, and who develop countries. The reality of it is that there are very, very few. And the question is, why are they so few? And it's a combination of things. And some of those things we know, some of them we don't know. Industry in Africa is the most difficult thing to do because there's no power, there's no energy. Every factory generates its own power. And it's quite infectious because I remember when I went to South Africa in the mid-90s, they never had power cuts. They never had potholes in the road, you know. And now, when I go there are power cuts. So it's sort of infectious. It goes around. And very few African countries have adequate power to create industries, to create jobs. Now, there's another slide I had, but I didn't include it in the end. I had one of a chap called Tijan Tiam, who you guys would know, who is the only African global CEO, as far as I'm aware. African, not black American. And I had 10 Indian global CEOs, Google, Microsoft, Pepsi Cola, you name them. Why is that? You all go to Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, all the nice schools. But I think the reason is that you finish and you go home. Because you think you're only African when you go home. But it doesn't matter whether you're in Vladivostok or Alaska, you're still African. It doesn't change. But I'll come to that later. The challenge for Africa and for Africans, including the leaders, and I talk to the leaders every now and then, and they don't like what I say to them. Because I think that the biggest challenge we have is to move from talk to action. I'm going to be 63 this year. And I worked out that over the last 30 years or so, I've attended maybe 300 conferences. I used to do a lot of it before I retired. Now I don't do as many. And it was always Africa rising. The time for Africa is now. It's like the donkey with the carrot at the end of the stick. It just keeps going and you keep hoping, when does that catch up with the carrot? Never quite does. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to get serious. And the most serious thing is that Africa has to say, we have to grow double digits. We have to stop fooling around, growing at 5% or 4% or 3%. That's not good enough. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we do that? And the thinking is a mindset issue. It is not a resource issue. Singapore, Japan, Switzerland, Dubai, you name it, it's not a resource issue. It's a mindset issue. You've got to ask yourself, if I want to grow in double digits, what do I do? And you do what you have to do. You cannot and you should not outsource your development to international investors or the international community. The old model of development has failed for Africa. We know that for a fact because Africa hasn't developed. It has developed, but it hasn't developed fast enough. There's no point moving at 10 miles an hour when the other guys are moving at 20, because then you'll never catch up. So the challenge for us as Africans is how do we catch up? And the first step is double-digit growth. There is a tendency in our continent, in Africa, to focus on symbols and not on action. Ghana was a hippie country 8 years ago, and it was the darling of the international community, and there was a lot of hype, and guess what? Last year, Ghana became a hippie country again. Nigeria moves in spurts and starts and all that. Why do we have this issue across the continent? And I'm going to tie this all to the issue of governance and the issue of youths and the issue of development. We need to ask ourselves, why do we have such small, pokey companies in Africa? Why don't we have big African companies? And what are the governments doing to encourage development in our continent? And the answer is very simple. They're doing nothing. Why don't we have an African Union passport? At least would allow free movement of people. Same way you have an EU passport. You don't require changing the constitutions of the country. It's just a decision that has to be taken. Action, not taken. Why don't we allow free movement of goods and services, of capital? Again, it's just the will, the ability to act as opposed to spending time doing the analysis for 30 years just not to take a decision, or because you're afraid of your neighbor. There are two aspects that bother me. One is we have to understand that microfinance companies, SMEs, do not develop countries. Countries are developed by big institutions that are developed by big banks. Big banks finance development. Small banks don't. Big bank cannot finance the development of roads, of power stations. Only big banks can do that. Microfinance institutions cannot do that. Small banks cannot do that. So in Kenya, you have 45, 50 banks. All little banks failing, they're all prone to shock. Kenya needs 4 or 5 very big banks. Then it reduces its reliance on international capital. Aliko Dangote, who I showed you, is putting up a $9 billion plant in Nigeria. Most difficult country in Nigeria. Nobody wants to go there. It's actually a very nice country when you go there, don't get me wrong, but the perception is there. Because the Nigerian banks have committed half of that money, 4.5 billion, because they're big enough to do it. He's been able to raise the balance internationally. You need big banks. We need to create bigger markets, open up the markets. And much more importantly, we need to do what the developed countries did before they got developed. Too often, people think that to be a millionaire, you have to behave like the millionaire. No, you do that, you go bankrupt. You do what he did before he became a millionaire. So the lessons for us is not what the West is telling us today, it's going back and seeing what the West did 50 years ago, 40 years ago. So if you take, for example, the US during the Depression, when Roosevelt became the president, what did he do? The public sector was absolutely critical to reviving the US economy and the US market. We must not and we should not devalue the importance of the public sector. The private sector is important, but the private sector only survives at the behest of the public sector. And the failure has not been in the private sector. The failure has been in the public sector. That's why the role of government and governance becomes extremely important. You're all very young students. You're going to go out and change the world. You're going to go out and make a difference. Let me ask a question. How many of you are going to go back and go into government? Into government. Become a civil servant. How many? None. Or one, two, okay. How many of you are going to go into politics? One, two. I'm impressed. Three. How many of you want to become fintech or entrepreneurs or whatever? Okay. I'm not going to hold it against you. but that's not what you should do. If you want to make a difference. If you want to make money, yes, do that. If you want to make a difference. The difference in Africa will be made from those who decide, for example, to go into politics and say, I'm going to become the president and I'm going to implement what I think should be done in Africa. My generation is gone. We lost it. We missed it. Your generation is the next generation to do that. The one in between are caught in between. It's like the ham in the middle of the sandwich. They're not. But your generation has the opportunity because of technology, because we have an open global society to make that change. So go into politics. Take the suffering. Forget about the money. Okay? Obama, when he went to government, was actually quite poor. He's going to come out a very rich and very popular man. You make the money after the politics. You retire, you make the speeches, and all your friends take care of you. Okay? That's how politicians work. Okay? Do not be corrupt. It's not necessary. And a major paradigm shift that we have in politics in Africa is that you take a very charming young lady, very aspirational, very idealistic, and you put them in politics and you turn out and you get a different creature. Corrupt, no integrity, the end justifies the means. We see that too often in Africa. And because I didn't trust myself, that's why I didn't go into politics. Because we're very normal people, very rational people that are respected. So there must have been some compelling reason for them to do that. But you don't have to go back to Africa to be African. You can be here, but be aspirational. Become the president of Coca-Cola, Microsoft. Because when you do that, you've taken the African risk out of the company. You are the African risk. If they allow you to be the president, where's the risk? So Tijan Tiam wants to go into Africa. Credit Suisse is not going to say, you don't know Africa, because he's African. Okay, he might decide not to go there for business reasons, but it will not be for risk reasons. The challenge and the problem with Africa is that you don't have enough senior Africans in global businesses. When I've seen enough senior Africans in global businesses, not even as CEO, the view on Africa has been a lot more balanced than when there wasn't an African. And if you want to make money, why don't you do it with a purpose? I'm going to industry, like Aliko Dangote, or into agriculture. But don't do like me and go and work for a bank or go and work for some other company. We did it because in our time we had no choice. At least that's the excuse we gave her. So, when you look at the challenge of business in Africa, and the challenge of governance, I think governance is overrated. It's important, but it's overrated. What is not given enough importance is action, execution. If you look at all the African countries, and I think the CEO of this center talked about competence, which is a very diplomatic way of putting about execution, getting things done. So you have to step back and ask yourselves, we have this conference, it's a 2-day conference. And I'm sorry I missed yesterday's, but I really would have loved to be here with you guys both days. And some of what I'm saying may have been said or may have been referred to. But you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of your conference? When you're saying challenging narratives, what are you challenging? If you're going to have challenging narratives and go back and do exactly what you were doing, then you haven't in any way challenged the narrative. So if all I do for you is to ask you, perhaps the perception and the reality are different. Perhaps being optimistic on Africa doesn't stop you from being realistic on the continent. Perhaps telling ourselves that Africa can do more for Africa than Africa is doing. So we go to the China-Africa Summit. We go to the Africa-EU Summit, the US-Africa Summit, Africa-India Summit, and we don't have an Africa-Africa Summit. Just to talk among ourselves and say, what are the 5 to 10 things we need to do to move this continent forward, to make a difference? I'm very passionate about Africa, ladies and gentlemen, because I spent 32 years in the continent. And I went to every single town that I could go to. I didn't want to go to Somalia because my insurance didn't cover that. So I was going to go there. And I don't think my wife would have loved it either, or my kids, so I didn't go there. But I came away with a very clear impression. The future of our continent, the future of Africa, rests in the hands of the Africans. And most of what Africa needs can be addressed by the Africans. You don't need foreigners to tell you to have one passport to allow you to go to the country. That can be done. You don't need foreigners to tell you should allow free movement of labor, of capital, of goods and services. Even in the energy space, if you look at Africa, Africa hosts 2 of the biggest deserts in the world, the Sahara Desert and the Namibia Desert. The good thing about solar energy is that the prices are dropping every day, and it's a very passive system. You put them there, and unless the terrorists come and break the things, you don't have to do much. And if you look at the map of Africa, Africa has the largest concentration of sunlight in the whole world. We can do it. So why are we not doing it? Who are we waiting for to get that done for us? So I'd like to conclude by just saying the following. The story of Africa, it's a new story to some extent, but it's an old story. 60 years after independence, after political independence, we're still trying to find our way. But that's fine, as long as we have a way. But unless and until the continent comes to terms with the realities, and we tell ourselves that in order to catch up with the rest of the world, we need to take certain steps. And whilst my generation cannot do that anymore, your generation have all the tools. You're going to the best university in the world, although my kids went to Cambridge, so they don't agree with that. They think Cambridge is a better university, but whichever way you look at it, going to the best universities in the world. When you live here, make a difference. And don't make a difference by saying, I'm going to go back and be a stinkingly rich entrepreneur. That's boring, right? I want to know that when I'm in my 70s or 80s, one of you is the president, I'll call you and I say, did you remember I gave you a talk in Oxford? Or maybe that made a difference. And I think that would be really cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that address. So we'll now open this up to a few questions from the audience.
First of all, I'd like to say thanks so much for an incredible and really inspiring talk. I'm Mark Brown. I'm studying at the Said Business School. The one question I had about your talk that I wasn't totally clear on was, are you advocating categorically against attracting foreign direct investment? I wasn't sure if I totally got that clear, and yeah, if so, I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, and yeah, maybe share the investment or the capital mobilization story that you have in your vision, if that's the case.
You want me to answer?
We'll take three.
Sorry, a number of questions.
Take three at a time.
Okay.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. My name is Joseph Isimite. I'm a PhD student at University College London. I think it's interesting you talk about the lack of action. And one thing I've noticed is the fact that there's no bias for action. So if we hear Africans, and I think it's also interesting you say that it's not a resource issue. So human resource, natural resource, we have lots of them. But in your opinion, what do you think is the reason for this lack of bias for action? I mean, we know of African countries where they have Vision 2020, Vision 2022, and they're very fantastic on paper. And it's been like that for such a long time. So what's the main reason why there's no bias for action in many parts of Africa?
Hello, my name is Thelma, and I'll take your advice and go into government. But I just wanted to ask, you spoke about free movement between countries in Africa and how that might help the economy. But I wanted to ask, do you think that Africa is ready for this with all this conflict between neighboring countries? Do you actually think that Africa is ready for free movement of labor across the countries?
Okay. Actually, these are very easy questions. So. I'm not advocating not attracting foreign capital into Africa. On the contrary, I'm advocating the reverse. But I'm saying that Africa must show that it wants foreign capital. If you look at the mix of capital going into Africa, outside of the natural resource sector, most of them portfolio capital, hot money, stuff like that. The Nigerian stock exchange just goes up and down, depending on the inflow and outflow of foreign capital. Contrast that with China, where the focus has been more on FDI, direct investments. That's not what's happening in Africa. The only African country, excuse me, that's trying to do that effectively is Ethiopia. They're trying to get people to invest in farms, in projects, for the simple reason that you cannot take the farm back home. But if you put your money in the stock markets and something happens in Timbuktu, then you move your money out of the Kenyan stock market. Never mind that Timbuktu is further away from Kenya than Ukraine is from the UK. So my point is, in order to attract foreign investment at the level that you require, first of all, you have to try and change the mix. But second, you have to show that the country and its citizens have confidence in the economy. So I'll give you some examples. If you look at the figure on how much is held out by Africans outside national market, if half of that money, even if a fifth of that money was brought back, the African energy problem is resolved overnight. So why is the money out there? What it tells you is that the Africans themselves, the nationals, don't have enough confidence in their economy. So if they don't, how do you expect foreign investors to come in? And the degree of foreign investment, FDI, I don't mean portfolio investment because I make a distinction there, remains exceedingly low. But in markets, even China, in spite of what they say about China, it's a large market, it's attractive and all that, China was very clear. They had the A and B shares. And they tried to make sure the B shares did not create major issues for the economy, but they wanted people to come in and set up factories to actually help develop it. So what I'm asking for is actually the opposite. The lack of bias for action. You've raised a very important issue. I actually not sure why. Because it's not because they're not smart enough. I think it's a mindset thing. I think we have to get our leaders, and it's not just in the public sector, it's also in the private sector. I ran Ecobank for 2 stints, total about 12 and a half years. And the biggest challenge I had was this lack of, the absence of this ability to get things done. There are all sorts of psychological and theoretical issues about it. I think it's developmental. I think it's a process. I certainly feel that my generation started to do something, but we did not, we stayed away from politics. Politics was considered for people who weren't smart enough to do other things. But now I think politics is opening up, and I think there's the option for smart young people like yourselves to go there and put in some ability to take things from the idea to the reality. So I don't have an answer for it. It's something that I've observed. I don't think that people just come to meetings just for the sake of coming to meetings, but it might well be that that's what they do. Because, coming to meetings is very lucrative. You get what is called an extra code. You get a subvention for going to meetings. So you go to meetings, but I really don't have an answer to that. And the third question was to do with free movement of people. don't believe all the hype you hear. Yeah? One of the countries I really love the most is Zimbabwe. And I read all the rubbish in the international press. It wasn't all lies. I mean, there was some truth in it. But I flew into Zimbabwe, and if you've gone to Zimbabwe, it's what you call the airport test. Okay? That is, you go, and depending on the experience you have at the airport, that sort of determines your view of the country. So by the time you hit Lagos Airport and you go through it, you say, wow, this is a crazy country. But Zimbabwe was very pleasant. Everything worked. And the driver was a graduate, so we had a very good discussion about it. Well, he was very open about it. It wasn't like he could have been a member of the intelligence service, but he was very, very open about it. And you went to stay in the Mikkels Hotel, you walk around. It's one of the few cities in Africa where you can actually walk around the central business district safely. Okay? So I don't think that the issue is people wanting to go. The issue is they have to be able to go. Right now, if you have, where are you from? Ghana. If you have a Ghanaian passport, you want to go around Africa, in most cases you can, but you need to have a visa. If you have a British passport, you can fly in and just show your passport, and they'll let you in. Same person. It's silly. I mean, I went to one of the countries and I brought up my Nigerian passport. He said, oh, we don't accept that. So I said, here's my British passport. Oh, yeah, you can come in. It's Africa. So I think, well, those sort of temporary issues like maybe problem in Burundi or whatever can maybe stop people from going, but it should not impede the African Union, for example, saying if you have an African passport, it should be an African Union passport, which means you can go to any member country, same as you have an EU passport, which allows you to go to every member country. All the Ghanaians are not going to move to South Africa. Neither are the South Africans going to move to Ethiopia. People don't move that much. They'll move if there's a job for them. And so you start beginning to create a more efficient labor market. I think that's the point I was trying to make.
We'll take the last two questions.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the speech that you've given. I am Rachel, and I'm currently working as a construction planner. The question I have is that you say that we need to grow the African economy from the single digit to the double digit. We say that we need to follow the models that have been used by these other nations before they started to get things wrong. But my question is that I am pretty sure that people in power at the moment, especially for Nigeria, they know these things. Why are they not being followed? And if they are not being followed, how would I say easy, quote unquote, is it for young people like us who have lived here and who have studied these things to get into those positions where we can actually change these policies and make a difference? Because getting into politics or into government in Nigeria, because I'm from Nigeria, I don't think it's that easy to get in as it is for me to get into politics here in the UK. So what steps and how can we actually start not just talking about it, start making moves and start actually acting out what we are talking about and what we've learned and the experiences that we've gained from here?
Okay.
Thank you very much for the speech. My name is Delani, and my question actually builds up quite a bit on what she just said. So I think from yesterday, I think people heard the talk by Obiageli as a Quilisi. I'm actually Nigerian, so I'm sorry. So yeah, she there was a sense of we young Africans who have big dreams of what we want Africa to be should focus more on trying to get into government as opposed to just trying to start like businesses. So but for sort of as a young African who is passionate about African, you have you have all the skills you've gained and everything, and you say you want to go into government, and you see like how government is right now. Like, I don't know if you know. I saw this the news of what happened in Edo State in Nigeria when a speaker got impeached, and there was a massive brawl in parliament. So when you see things like that happening, like, you imagine, like, practically, even if you do get into parliament, like, what are the practical steps that you think people like us could actually take when you're surrounded by this environment of just almost, I don't know how to describe it. It's like you're basically fighting against the wave, if you like. And then the second question is also building up on that is what are the things you would say you can see in politics now that give you hope for the future and would make you say, okay, I see things now that I didn't see maybe 20 years ago, that make you think, okay, like, young people like us is actually a realistic prospect for us to actually get into politics. So what would you say are the good signs you see now that you didn't see before? And so the first question is, what are the practical steps we will take if we actually got in there? And then the second one is, what are the signs you see right now that give you hope for the future, really, in the political scene specifically? Thank you.
I'll take one more.
Thank you so much. My name is Nayami Nataja, and I'm from Senegal. And thank you so much for your talk. I have a question. From yesterday, we were talking about this, going back and coming as youth into government. But Senegal, where I'm from, what I observed is even this generation, or our actual president, when he was running his campaign, he has really good thought, and he wanted to make a change. And I realized that once people become president, they are not able, it is as if they want it so bad, and once they have it, they don't know what to do with it. And what I realized in trying to understand is, for instance, the colonial legacy, they have a vision. They created, Dakar was the capital of West Africa, and they organized education system, agriculture. They made trains, not because they wanted our welfare, but because they have to put back the arachide to Dakar in order to export it to Europe in order to make, yes. So how do we build actually our vision? And if today I want to be the president of Senegal, how am I going to be sure that once I'm going to get that seat, I'm going to be a good one, and I will know actually what to do with it? And the second question I have for you is, what's your vision for Africa? And what do you think, what Africans can build and make things happen? Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. You asked why Africa is not growing in double digits. After all, it really does know that. The question is, do they know it? Do they know it? I don't think they do. Nigeria I know quite well. Because I spent all that time with EcoBank, I have a pretty good knowledge of most of these countries, including Senegal quite well, actually. And I think the three of you have touched on something very, very interesting, and I think that's the crux of what I was trying to put across. Why do these guys not make the change? And I'll answer it in two ways. One is psychological. You know, just because a guy wears a suit doesn't mean he's civilized. Just because a guy goes to college doesn't mean he's educated. Most African leaders are one or two generations removed from peasantry. I'm giving you a response because my wife is a psychologist, and I spend a lot of time talking to her about this. And she tells me that in psychology, your experiences when you're growing up has a significant impact on you. So if you spent In the morning, you walked for 5 miles to fetch water, get back home, then another 5 miles to go to school, and came back. You'll be walking like that in your head for the rest of your life. And therefore, when you get into a position of power, what's essentially important to you is safety and security. It's not doing stupid things. And that's why when they start to steal, they start with the first million, then the second, then the third, and then they can't stop. You can explain it psychologically. That's a psychological explanation. And the reason I have a bit of hope in you guys is that you don't have that problem. Because it's called progress. You know, in Africa they say, let me be better than my father and let my children be better than me. That's what progress is all about. I think until we break that bond so that people do not, or psychologically are not impaired in terms of how they contribute to their country, that's a major challenge. A lot of African leaders, you know, the Rogues Gallery that I showed you of African leaders, they're first generation now. All their parents were peasants. This guy saw abject poverty. You cannot ask them to be what they're not. It's a second question you've asked, which is even more interesting, which is why is it that when people go into government, they change in Africa? I think there are two reasons, because I do have friends in politics. One is that I suspect that they feel they have to change to get things done. Okay? Being an outlier in politics is a very lonely place to be. And typically they chop you off after that. So you either conform or you find you're totally ineffective. But there's another string to what's been asked, which I find very interesting. I think most of you look at politics with some disdain. Yeah? Now, there was a Rhodes Scholar here who became president of the United States of America. His name was Bill Clinton. He decided to be a politician right from the beginning. Came from very poor background, you know, very poor, but he was smart. He built himself through the state and then went on to. You cannot have your cake and eat it. If you want to make a difference, ladies and gentlemen, you have to take the pain. You have your good education, you go into your respective countries, you start to work your way up the system, step by step. And it is not true that you cannot do it. You can do it. You can do it for two reasons. One is because you're smart, one good reason. The other reason is that you have more tools now. You have technology. You have social media. Obi Ezekwesili, that's her name, you know. I know you were confusing the K's and the S's. Quite frankly, it's not in politics, but she's become almost like a symbol for good governance, for challenging government to do what they're supposed to do. Okay? And a lot of what she's doing is built on social media, on networks. In some of my, when I've had a glass of wine or some whiskey, I ask myself, why don't we create a network of Africans with an agenda of the things that we need to transform our continent and get everybody involved, whether they're Zimbabweans, Ghanaians, whatever it is. And we start building up a common agenda and putting pressure on this government. I think that the potential is there for young people like yourself to be creative in your thinking, to be passionate in what you want to do, and to say, I'm going to make a difference, and I'm going to do my best to make a difference. It doesn't guarantee that you'll succeed, but it does suggest that you should try your utmost best. And I actually feel that You know, the average politician is not smarter than you guys. They're not. So why do you feel that you can't do it? The reason, I think, is because you all come into nice places like this. You want to wear a suit like me, get in an air-conditioned car, send your kids very nice schools, go home. Politics is graft. Making a difference takes a lot of graft. I'll just give you an example and then I'll close out the responses. I was 42 when I left Citibank to go join EcoBank. I was the most senior front office African in Citibank here in London. I lived in Primrose Hill, cost the bank a fortune. I had an official car. I got up one day and I told my boss that I was leaving City to go and work for EcoBank, and he said, "What? Echo what?" I said, "EcoBank, we've never heard of it." "What do they do?" I said, "They bank in 5 countries." So he didn't ask me a question. He said, "Arnold, why would you leave Citibank and go work for a bush bank?" And that's going to be the title of my book, The Bush Banker, but that's coming. And I told him that, look, I wanted to make a difference. I was 42, and my kids were still quite young. I could make a career change and have enough time before I was 50 to recover if things didn't go well. And he gave me the assurance. He said, "No, you won't stay more than 6 months. And you have a job. Just come back. Don't feel shy. Just come back. You have a job." Maybe I was too proud. Maybe I was a little bit, when you're young like that, you sort of think you know everything. So I decided I wasn't going to go back. I went into this place. It was the dingiest office I've ever had in my life. The place was near bankrupt. And I thought longingly one evening, over a glass of wine, maybe I should take my boss's offer and go back. Okay? I'd moved out of London, living in Primrose Hill, going to the theater, and I was stuck in Togo. There was nothing there, nothing to do weekends. I'm not an alcoholic, so drinking is not my hobby. My family and kids were all here in Oxford. What do you do? The easy way was to go back. I said to myself, I'm not going to go back. I'm going to build EcoBank into a pan-African bank. And so I went to my board of directors, and we had a generational gap because I was in my early 40s, they were in their mid to late 60s. And they said, "Young man, do you know what you're talking about?" I said, "First of all, sirs, I'm not that young." Okay? Because I knew that John F. Kennedy became president at 44, so he was just 2 years older than me. But I've thought this through, and this is what I was going to do. And we started growing the group. And we grew it. I think it was 35 or 36 countries when I left. And we did it. It was difficult. It was tough. There were no airlines. Or you took some very dodgy airlines. An airline with only one plane is a very dodgy airline. Okay? So you do stuff like that. You go to Ouagadougou, you go to Bobo Dioulasso, you go to Lilongwe. Okay, and I can give you all sorts of names where we went. Some by road, some by air. But we did it. Because failure was not an option. It got done. And I always want to remember what Nelson Mandela always said. It always seems impossible until it is done. It can be done. Thank you.
Thank you for that inspiring address. We'll now go to breakout sessions. There will be one session in here and one session in the next lecture theater. One of them will be on Made in Africa, foreign versus domestic development, and one will be on education and multilingualism. So please feel free to shuffle around to your respective sessions. Thank you.